You hear the music first, a broken piano hammering out something that used to be a tune. Then comes the shouting, the boots thudding against warped floorboards, the crash of glass, the slurred voices yelling for another round. But the moment you open the saloon doors, you're hit with something else. The smell. It's not a smell, really. It's a full-on assault, a cocktail of things that have no business mixing together. Rotten wood, wet hay, stale beer, spit, sweat, spilled blood, smoke, grease, and something you can't quite place. Something that might have once been human. That's when it hits you. This place smells worse than any outhouse you've ever been in. And back then, outhouses were just a hole in the ground and a prayer. The floor was a crime scene. Let's start at the ground level. Literally, most saloons had wooden floors, sometimes just bare dirt covered with hay or sawdust. Why? Because people spit, spilled drinks, threw up, bled, and did things they weren't proud of on those floors, and the sawdust was the cheapest way to cover it all up. Every morning, barkeeps would rake the floor like a stable, dragging up clumps of spit-soaked sawdust, rotten bits of food, cigarette butts, and whatever had been tracked in by boots, horses, or worse. Did they wash it? No. Water was precious, soap even more so. They just piled on more sawdust and hoped no one slipped in something alive. Some saloons had floors so layered with filth that you could track time by what you stepped in. 1869, that's the dark stain near the piano. 1872, that's still stuck to the back of your heel. The spittoons overflow wed chewing tobacco was everywhere. And cowboys didn't chew quietly. They'd sit for hours, jaw rolling, building up a sticky mouthful of brown sludge. And then, with no warning, PPHFT, right into the spittoon. That is, if they aimed well. Most didn't. Spit hit the walls, the piano, the cards, other people. And if you looked closely, you'd find trails of brown goo leading away from every table, like little rivers of cowboy shame. Spittoons filled fast and weren't emptied often. Some just got kicked over and left. The floor absorbed the rest. That smell, that's months-old tobacco juice slowly fermenting. The bar itself was sticky. For you'd think with all the booze flowing, the bar would be the cleanest place in the saloon. Wrong. Every drink spilled, every elbow planted in sweat, every glass rim left on wood just added to the permanent glaze of filth. Some bars were never fully dry. They had a tacky feel, like a bar had been made of syrup and forgotten in the sun. And behind the counter, even worse. Bottles wiped with the same rag for a decade. Crates full of broken glass, dead flies, and mystery puddles that no one questioned. If you ordered something strong, it probably came with something floating in it. And the floaters had names. The windows didn't help. You might think they opened windows for ventilation. Nope. Saloons kept the windows mostly shut to keep the heat in, the fights private, and the sheriff out. That meant all the odors, from pipe smoke to sweat-soaked hats, just stayed. Curtains were rarely washed. Flies buzzed thick in the corners. One barkeep claimed his curtains were so stiff they stood up without the rod. The kitchen was a gamble. Not every saloon served food, and the ones that did maybe shouldn't have. You might get a slab of beef so old it growled, beans cooked in a pot that hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War, bread so hard it could stop a bullet or worse, food cooked in reused grease from last week's pork, that greasy, metallic, sour smell coming from the back room. That wasn't chili, that was danger. Add rats. Always add rats. No saloon was rat-free. Not one. They lived in the walls, the floors, the barrels. You'd be sitting at a table and feel something brush your boot. That wasn't the waitress. That was dinner stealing your dinner. They chewed through food crates, nibbled spilled biscuits, and sometimes fell into the beer barrels. Some men still drank it. Some men preferred it. The smell was alive. It wasn't just that saloons were dirty. It was that they never got clean. The dirt just changed forms, from spit to sawdust, from beer to mold, from blood to memory. It soaked into the walls, into the floor, into your clothes, your hair, your soul. Men left the saloon smelling like the saloon, and no amount of river water could wash it off. The main saloon room was bad enough, but if you wandered deeper, past the smoky bar and spit-stained floor, you found the real source of the smell. The back rooms, Where the light faded, the rules disappeared. And hygiene went to die. The piano was a biohazard. Every saloon had a piano. It was the crown jewel, covered in dust, soaked in beer, occasionally on fire. The keys were stained from whiskey, tobacco juice, and dried blood. Some were chipped, others stuck from being played with greasy fingers and busted knuckles. More than one had teeth marks from brawls gone sideways. No one cleaned it. No one tuned it. But everyone used it, sometimes as a weapon. One story tells of a man being slammed face first into the keys for playing off-tempo. He survived. The piano didn't, and the smell, imagine, would soaked in beer, blood, and sorrow for 12 years. Then lit on fire and extinguished with spit. The card tables were swamps. Every table was a trap, not for cheating, but for fungus grease. And forgotten food. Crumbs piled up in the corners. Mold grew in the felt. Coins stuck to the surface. Elbows lifted up with resistance. And that wasn't the worst part. People spilled everything during poker games, whiskey cows bowls. Whatever. They didn't want to run to the outhouse. For more than once, a fight ended with someone pinned face down in the mess. He came up coughing and smelling like he'd lost more than the hand. What was that in the corner? There were always dark corners in saloons. Nobody asked about them, but they always smelled worse. Sometimes it was a busted spittoon. Sometimes it was something dead. Sometimes it was someone passed out and using the corner as a toilet. You could tell how bad it was by how fast the flies gathered, or how far the regulars sat from it. One barkeep claimed a corner stain had grown its own name. They called it Old Henry. The fights left more than bruise. Fighting was a nightly event. You'd hear a chair scrape, a bottle break, someone yell something about cheating or someone's sister, and then the fists would fly. And with the fists came broken nose, spilled teeth, blood, lots of blood occasionally. A man crashing through the floorboards. They didn't clean it up. They just let it soak in. Maybe threw some more sawdust down. Maybe flipped the table over it. Over time, some saloons developed permanent stains under the poker tables. You could trace the outline of a man if you squinted. They said if you licked the floor, you could taste the entire 1870s. Do not lick the floor. The bathroom situation, or lack of it. Here's a fun fact. Most saloons didn't have bathrooms. If you had to go, you had 3 choices. Walk to the outhouse behind the saloon, freezing, far, and probably occupied by a snake. Find a dark corner. Use the bucket out back, if it hadn't already tipped over. And when it came to the other need, you held it, or didn't, which is why some bar stools were permanently damp. One bartender said he mopped only when it rained inside. The house brew smelled like riggerteef. You ordered beer in a saloon. You weren't getting anything close to what you'd recognize today. Sometimes it was homemade, brewed out back in barrels that also stored dead rats, broken tools, and yesterday's chili. Sometimes it was cut with water, whiskey, turpentine, or, if they were generous, root sap. The result, a drink that smelled like varnish and tasted like betrayal. You drank it anyway. Why? Because it was wet. And sometimes warm. And sometimes cheaper than coffee. The smell got into your bones. People didn't just smell the saloon. They brought it with them. Clothes reeked. Hair carried the stink. Even your teeth absorbed it. Some cowboys swore they could taste the saloon in their own sweat 2 days later. Women who worked upstairs often bathed in whiskey just to overpower. The scent didn't always work. And the worst part, you got used to it. By now, you've made peace with the floor stains, the spittoons, and the whiskey that may or may not include turpentine. But the smell, it's still there, still getting worse. Why? Because we haven't even gone upstairs yet. The upstairs rooms, where smells went to. Every saloon had an upstairs, and it was never ventilated. Those upper rooms were usually where the ladies lived, the women who kept the cowboys company. But they weren't just bedrooms. They were offices, dining areas, sick bays, and when times were bad, makeshift quarantine rooms. The beds were rarely washed. The sheets hadn't seen soap since the railroad came through. Most rooms had chamber pots, and those didn't always get emptied. In summer, the heat rose. So did the stench. Imagine a small, windowless wooden room. One man sweating through his 3rd night of fever. A pan of stew left too long. Cigarette smoke curling into the ceiling. Wet socks drying on a broken Chirikov. Behind the door that never stops, that smell didn't drift. It sank into the floorboards and came back up the next day. The sick stayed upstairs until they didn't. Saloons didn't have doctors on staff. And if a man got sick, he didn't go to a hospital. He went upstairs. Fever, infections, infected gunshots, tooth rot, food poisoning, all ended in one of those stuffy little rooms. If they got better, they left. If they didn't, well, sometimes they stayed too long. There are stories of upstairs doors being locked for days. No one went in. Just trays left at the door. One day, the trays stopped getting picked up. After that, they just boarded up the room and moved on. The saloons didn't stop for sickness. Here's the thing. No matter how bad it got upstairs, the party downstairs never stopped. You could have a man delirious from infection in the attic, a funeral wagon parked out back, and still a piano banging away with cowboys, to drinks deep singing off-key. People didn't talk about it. They didn't look up. Because in the Wild West, if it didn't bleed on the poker table, it wasn't your problem. The food wasn't safe, even when you cooked it, even if you were lucky enough to get something hot from the kitchen. It probably came from a pot that hadn't been scrubbed in weeks. A meat supply that included questionable donations, a bucket of grease so thick you could carve your name into it. Some saloons bought meat from passing trappers, some from unspecified sources. One report described a stew where the cook couldn't confirm the species. They tried to mask it with pepper, with salt, with whiskey, but the smell always pushed through. Greasy, sour, and somehow warm even when cold. The basement. Don't ask. Some saloons had basements. Most didn't talk about them. That's where the barrels went. The rats, the cleaning rags, the things that got thrown out but never left. Some say that's where barkeeps stored dead livestock until they could bury them. Others used it to stash stolen goods, broken chairs, and unwanted guests. There's a story about a man who tried to sneak downstairs to use the cool air as a nap room. He came back up, but never spoke again. Death was part of the atmosphere. People died in saloons. In the chairs, on the floor, on the piano, upstairs, out back. Sometimes it was natural. Sometimes it was over a spilled drink or a marked card. Either way, it left a trace. The blood dried. The smell stayed. The story grew. Barkeep wiped it up. New sawdust. Same stool. Next customer. Everything soaked in wood, fabric, skin. None of it was sealed. All of it was porous. That meant every drink spilled, every mouthful of spit, every sigh from a fevered man. It went in, stayed in, and once the weather turned humid, it came back out. That's when the smell walked around on its own. If you thought the saloon was bad at night, try walking in the morning after. No music, no shouting, just chairs tipped over, windows half open, and the quiet hum of flies, thousands of them, dancing over everything that got spilled, dropped, or left behind. And in that silence, the smell hit you harder than ever. No sweat or smoke to cover it. Just raw, stale filth. Flies were the first to wake up before the piano, before the bartender. The flies were already at work. They hovered over spilled stew, hardened to the table. Read beer puddles in the floor, cracks, bits of tobacco-stained teeth left from a fistfight, soggy bread under a stool, something in the corner that no one wanted to check. They were thick, persistent, and they didn't care if you waved your hand. They'd land on your face just to remind you who ran this place now. The smell was in the furniture. Chairs were upholstered with old burlap and leather. They absorbed everything. Sit down, and you get a whiff of 10 years of cigarette smoke, whiskey spills, back sweat from men who hadn't bathed into states, and whatever happened last night. That involved screaming and a broken bot. Leaving the bar stools groaned when sat on, not from weight, but from trauma. The carpets were alive when they had them. Some of the fancier saloons had carpets. You'd think that meant they were cleaner. You'd be wrong. Those carpets were sponges of sin, never washed, rarely replaced, always sticky. Men passed out on them. Animals walked over them. One saloon kept finding cigarette butts sprouting mold near the piano. Eventually, they just gave up and nailed the carpet to the floor to keep it from crawling away. The air turned so as heat rose outside. The air inside thickened. You didn't breathe it. You swallowed it. Hot, greasy, sour. with a hint of cigar ash, pickled onions, and last night's beans. Newcomers gagged at the door. Locals barely noticed. They said the trick was not to inhale. To deep. One gambler wore a kerchief soaked in vinegar. Another just drank until he couldn't smell anything. The smell got into you might spend 1 hour in a saloon. But the smell, it stayed with you all week. It stuck to your shirt, your hair, your hat. Some claimed it even seeped into your dreams. The worst part, you couldn't describe it. You'd try, smoky, spicy, like something that died but kept talking, but it never quite fit. Because it wasn't just a smell. It was the memory of everything wrong that had happened inside those walls. Some men never washed it off. There were cowboys known for it. The ones who smelled like a saloon even after a river bath. You'd ride past and catch a whiff. Old liquor, rotten tobacco, muddy leather, and shame. People gave them space, not because they were dangerous, but because you couldn't unsmell them once they'd walked by. One woman described dancing with a man who had the scent of old cards and regret baked into his coat. She married him anyway. You couldn't build a saloon without the smell. Here's the truth. The smell was part of it. If you walked into a saloon and it didn't punch your nose, it wasn't real. It needed to be. Sweetie smoke histakinties slightly on fire. That was home. That was the West. That was the smell of the last man who lost a hand of poker and a front tooth before breakfast.